Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the movie Cashback, which is ultimately right now to the second this recording on Hulu. Hulu. I love saying it like that. Reasonably, this movie, I honestly am just kind of throwing caution to the wind today and kind of mentioning this movie because this movie has a lot to do about a man who eventually gets to see some things about a female form, and then ultimately that kind of spurs him being able to consistently, one way or another, see the forms of a female form. But reasonably, this movie opens with a breakup that leads to this guy in a very Fight Club, Edward Norton like way not being able to sleep. He realizes that with the inability to sleep, that ultimately he has a lot of extra time on his hands. So what does he do with that extra time? He ultimately goes and works the night shift at a grocery store of sorts. It's not a general goods store because ultimately it looks like it's mostly a grocery store. Normally, I would probably go into a movie like this and gripe about every little retail thing because ultimately I had been in retail before. But while watching this movie, I ultimately didn't have any of those kinds of moments. I think really that's kind of past me, and ultimately like griping on every little thing in a movie as far as a retail thing would just be like, what is the point? Going into this, I just enjoy the simplicity of the movie. I enjoy the artistry of the movie. I like that the fact that Ben is an artist, and I think that that is the most interesting thing about this film. I like also that it seems that things are going to work out for him at the end, and also I like seemingly that there is uh, kind of just some interesting characters. We have an interesting boss named Jenkins. We have an interesting, seemingly quasi interesting coworker named Sharon. That ultimately, it seems that we're not really quite sure if Ben is ultimately going to, uh, f- uh, like end up with this girl or not, or ultimately any number of any guys that are any of her coworkers are going to end up with her. We ultimately have a girl named Susie in this movie that ultimately is the culprit of the very first breakup. Ultimately, I know Susie from this show called Jekyll, and ultimately I was like, oh my god, yeah, she was in this show. And then I saw her in Jekyll. I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. It told me remember her being in those shows. Well, the show Jekyll in this movie, Cashback. So, what is this movie actually about? Well, we have it to where seemingly a man is gone so far deep into not sleeping at night to the point where at some point he can almost seemingly have the power or opportunity to be able to stop time or even slow it down to the point where ultimately him being able to stop time sometimes is a benefit just because ultimately there are some times where Ben will stop time and basically, let's just say, adjust the wardrobe of any of the number of the customers that are in the store because reasonably his fascination with the female form, let's just say, ultimately just kind of makes it to where there's interesting like artwork being done all over this grocery store, let's just say. Uh, how how reasonably Ben is like we go through Ben's like kind of span of life to ultimately we have to show his very first encounter with a French woman and that ultimately kind of spurns the very first time that he's ever seen a female form of sorts. And so ultimately, that eventually churns into him eventually getting a best friend, and him ultimately leading on to more times of which that he's just like he finds a woman just beautiful to the point of almost quite possibly getting a girlfriend but like it never like the thing of it is just like he's just kind of like he's just kind of like the guy that's like he's not pressing any girl, like he's just kind of like, well, hey, like you're really nice and stuff, so like wouldn't it just be great wouldn't it just be great if like we hung out or whatever. But really we just have Ben just kind of like not trying to push to get with any number of girls, and then eventually like this girl kind of floats to him, and ultimately he's just like, you know what, like you know what, he might be an interesting character, or he might be an interesting cat, so maybe I'll go and ask him out. So I think with that, that's all probably I really will need to want to say in non spoiler like variation. If ultimately there probably isn't maybe much for a female audience to go, oh yeah, I want to see that kind of like, ooh yeah, like. But when looking at it, I'm like, nah, I'm just throwing caution in the wind. Again, I reasonably have seen this movie a couple times, and so reasonably to me, it's just like, nah, like whatever, I'll throw this movie out there to talk about. So without a doubt, let's go into the double five to otherwise spoil this movie. At the end of the day, I just find this movie to be fun, and I don't really like. It kind of gets to the point where I've kind of seen a lot of different kinds of movies towards the end of the day, where in a lot of ways, like just kind of seeing a undressed woman ultimately just like, oh, okay, that's kind of just the normal run of the mill thing. Because I've seen so many movies, good God. There were some movies that I didn't even realize would have stuff like that, and ultimately I open up the movie, I'm like, oh my God, this movie is a little bit shock value for you. Wow, this movie is weird, and I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting this movie to be this, and then I just found it like I just found it mentally like I was mentally curious by just the overall attempt of this movie, as well as attempts of other films that ultimately just kind of like, hey, wow, this movie's weird, but F it, I like weird movies. So let's go into that double five if I haven't already. Let's call it a spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time to spoil this movie that is ultimately on Hulu at the current second of this recording. So, spoilers now. So ultimately, this we have an opening of this movie where Ben ultimately is to be broken up by Susie. It seems like she is throwing all kinds of furniture and stuff at him, which ultimately I'm just like, okay, I guess like if ultimately they're gonna break up, might as well just break all his furniture while you're at it. Reasonably, we get a consensus of why they broke up and stuff along those lines. So pushing on after the breakup to our ultimately after this breakup, we have it to where Ben just cannot sleep, and so reasonably at first he ends up like reading books, and then ultimately he ends up rereading books, and he ultimately just tries to find something to just bide his time. And then ultimately he realizes like, well, hey, like I'm going in a grocery store and they want help wanted. Ultimately there's a night shift that ultimately needs to be covered. So ultimately we have it to where Ben goes and applies for this, and ultimately we have Jenkins that is ultimately taking his application going, great, yeah. Normally an interview like that doesn't really happen all that easy, where like somebody just like looks at an interview and just like, and then hires them on the spot. Normally it's just like, oh, well, we have to do a background check, or we have to do this and that, and then we'll call you. But like maybe this story is just so desperate they could not give a crap. Like, hey, like, whatever. Like, we just want somebody to fill a spot. It's overnight, and if it doesn't work out, we'll just fire them. But yeah, a lot of people have to do the official hiring and stuff like that, so it's not really that easy. But anyways, so we go into here, and we ultimately find that that Ben is ultimately doing his first shift, and we have We have we have Sharon, who ultimately walks in and she is late for her shift. We ultimately have it to where uh, Jenkins is ultimately just kind of like, oh, you're late again, I see. But then he like bizarrely like slaps her on the butt, and I'm like, dude, that's no. If anything, like a woman should be putting up with that. But if anything, like they like it happens in the scene, but there's like nothing that really comes of it. Where ultimately, I think Jenkins is trying to get with Sharon, but Sharon has zero interest, and I don't know. Like at some points, like it's just like yeah, Jenkins is a weird bird, but ultimately there's some times where he is kind of the comic relief at some points in this movie too. But anyways, so we ultimately have Ben kind of going through his shifts, and ultimately he's like, man, like if anything, it comes down to talking about time, how ultimately people don't want to really look at their watches or look at a clock because ultimately it'll supposedly slow time down. To ultimately we have Sharon, who ultimately has a piece of tape over her watch, so she won't be able to tell exactly what time it is. So push on. We have it to where Ben eventually notices that there are two coworkers that work in the meat department that are ultimately kind of very trying to do like some shock value like things, ultimately asking a woman desperately what she needs, and she's like, sausage. It's like, yeah, I bet you need some sausage. To ultimately they're kind of holding out a sausage in a very obscure position down by their down by their pants, ultimately going, yeah, I bet she needed some sausage. So we ultimately have it to where we also find out that it seems like there is a scheme afoot between these two guys that are doing this meat product thing. Ultimately, we have it to where they are really desperately trying to sell these like shampoo ash like bottles, and evidently these shampoo ash like bottles resemble a certain kind of toy, let's just say. And so recently we have it to where there's guys who are ultimately kind of jokingly seeing a lot of women that are shopping during that time, and so ultimately um, they ultimately kind of, when the girls' backs turned, they ultimately put this little shampoo bottle or shampoo thing into uh, their baskets and or just anywhere, and you have it to where ultimately like a woman is just kind of going through their groceries, and ultimately they're looking at this thing and they're like, nah, how about I just buy it? And ultimately, like the cashier's like, yeah, because ultimately it looks like a motorized weighing, let's just say. So ultimately, it yeah, like ultimately every single time that uh a girl buys this, they get all excited. They're like, yeah, she bought one. I don't care what she uses it for. But anyways, it's some weird, bizarre agenda that they have to try to sell this product, and I thought it was hilarious. So pushing on, we ultimately have it to where we find out that ultimately Ben is an artist and he likes to draw, and so ultimately he goes into a art class, which ultimately we have a model that ultimately models for these people, and of course this model doesn't have anything on, and so ultimately we have it to where Ben ultimately is just kind of drawing one of the women that are in the class, and the teacher's like, excuse me, do you want to actually draw the model that paid to be here today? That I had to pay to be here today? And ultimately the Ben is like, okay, sure. And then so he draws the guy. Ultimately we have it to where we have to show Ben's first time of ever seeing a woman with just a towel over her head, and that was it. Ultimately, it seems like they had done some like foreign exchange pen pal thing, where ultimately they had some French girl ultimately living with Ben, and evidently this French girl was not shy about her body, and to ultimately she would just be walking around with again just a towel over her head, and that was it. Um, Hence, where that was the first time that Ben ever got to see anything like that. And ultimately, he would go into her. He would knock on a room, to like, "Excuse me, you dropped something." Ultimately, to see her again and over again. Um, we ultimately find that Ben seemingly gets a best friend that ultimately is named Sean, which ultimately Sean seems to have eventually found a interesting magazine, let's just say, an adult magazine, to ultimately, again, Ben can start to see again women. What do you think? So, pushing on. So, we ultimately have it to where Ben is just amazed by women, to the point to where he's kind of like fascinated. Like a woman that looks like this in a magazine could ultimately look like this in the normal day to day, like his teacher or anything else. At some point, he ends up really like having a crush on one girl that ultimately he kind of looks at, and she looks at him, and ultimately we find out that this girl has a had broke her arm and had needed a, God, what is it called, a cast. There we go. Ultimately she had gotten a cast, and so ultimately she had everybody sign it. Once the cast got removed, ultimately she had like hair all over her arms, like I would normally every single day of my life. And so we have to where these guys are shaming her on ultimately being a gorilla girl, I guess. Which, like, I got that all the time. I got werewolf and gorilla and all this kinds of crap. Who cares? You have hair on your arm. It's natural. But anyway, and plus I didn't quite understand how this girl ultimately got so much hair on her arm, because these kids looked really really young. I don't know. Um, but anyways, we have this girl who was ultimately crying and like, "Oh, I have hair in my arm," and I'm like, again, you're kind of still a little bit young to, in my thought process, to be getting hair anywhere. But who cares? Because ultimately, again, werewolf man, I am. That's okay. But anyways, we have this girl, and ultimately we have Ben who's consoling her. That is ultimately just like, hey, like, you know what? Like, I don't care if all the kids made fun of you. Like, I don't care. It's like, if anything, I think you're cool and I think you're nice and whatever. And so we have it to where Ben asks her, hey, do you want to meet after school and just kind of hang out a little bit? And ultimately, this girl agrees. And ultimately, Ben ends up kind of just waiting after school for this girl. And it seems like they're going to kiss, but ultimately he walks away, but then says like, "Hey, how about we like Saturday? How about we meet here?" Uh, Pushing on. So ultimately, we have Sean who knows about a very certain girl that becomes very popular in this neighborhood. Evidently, all the kids pay this girl a certain amount of cents, and she ultimately uh, drops trow or whatever, and ultimately of how much they pay her just to be able to see something. They lift the garage door up and down, and ultimately she ends up showcasing herself at some point. And that's what makes her the most popular girl of this whole entire town with these younger guys. So reasonably, we have it pushing on in this movie. We eventually have it to where uh, Ben eventually goes into the stopping of time, to the point where ultimately he is stopping the time in this grocery store, because ultimately he's just like, well, I really want to draw a girl, so ultimately I'll just stop the time in this grocery store to where everybody freezes, and then ultimately he just starts drawing women, and he just starts like in a mannequin way, just like adjusting all of their bodies to ultimately he can just see whatever. And ultimately he ends up having to reset them once he's done drawing them, adjusting their clothes and everything like that. So, and then he starts time back up again, and then ultimately we go through our normal day. We have it to where eventually Jenkins is throwing a soccer team thing with ultimately some rival, and ultimately Jenkins is talking about how great he is in soccer before he got injured and this and that. Like, yeah, I'm sure you were great, Jenkins. Like, I'm sure you're just all talk or whatever. But I also could see that also he could probably be a legitimate athlete as well. So whichever. So uh, we have to where Jenkins is pushing all of his employees to go to this soccer thing, and we ultimately find out that there's one new employee that ultimately knows karate, and we have it to where one of the guys ultimately tests him about that skill, and the kid ends up going like, "Oh, okay, well, grab my arm," and he slaps him in the face, and he's like, "Ma ha ha," and then he walks off. So we have it to where these guys do this soccer match, and ultimately they get their clock cleaned. It's like 27-0, and they're just like, dude, I just want to get one goal, and that's all I need to do. That's all we want. I don't care if we lose this thing. I just want to like at least score one goal. Ultimately, is what Jenkins' goal is. So, excuse me for a second. Juice. Anyways, so we have Jenkins who ultimately is telling them the last play of the game, and ultimately what ends up happening anyways is they try to do this play, and ultimately the play doesn't exactly work, and one of the guys kicks the ball into Jenkins' face to where he starts bleeding, and they ultimately end the game via that, and they rush Jenkins to the hospital. To ultimately, he has a neck brace on, and he has like this whole nose contraption and everything like that. And like I think some people are telling him like, "Oh yeah, you don't look that bad." It's yeah, like we're trying to be nice. But anyways, so eventually, Jenkins eventually is also mentioning that he has a birthday party, and so he wants, of course, everybody to go to that. We ultimately have Jenkins, who is pulling all the guys in, and ultimately saying, "Hey, I want a woman, a paid woman, to come to my party to." And I'm paraphrasing this, or I'm kind of going off. I'm trying to avoid saying a certain word. Let's just say. Um, I want a paid woman to come to my party and unclothe. So ultimately, everybody's like, yeah. So who's going to get this? Who's going to find this girl? And ultimately, we have Jenkins, who ultimately goes right to Ben. And Ben's like, huh? Why me? But of course, Ben ultimately knows Sean. And of course, Sean is just like this expert, let's just say, seemingly. And so Sean eventually goes and finds this place that ultimately has women that are let's just say quasi dancing, and ultimately we have Sean who's offering up uh, this amount of money to have this girl do this party. And while that is going on, Ben is ultimately looking off to in the distance, and ultimately he is seeing uh, like I would probably call this a fantasy because I don't think that this really actually happened, because it doesn't actually make sense to me. Um, but we have it seemingly where Sharon and Ben, after the football game or after the soccer game, however way you want to say it, after the football soccer game, we have it to where they go out and they go and they drink with one another, not alcohol, but just kind of like a tea or coffee or whatever, and they just start to talk and everything like that, talk about their dreams and everything like that. And eventually Sharon really likes Ben. Ultimately, Sharon had probably went and tried to date one of the other guys there, but ultimately, the other coworker had talked about how how well he was yeah, I got with this girl, yeah, and he's talking about how uberly confident he was, and he's telling his like story about how amazing he was and blah 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 blah, that garbage that ultimately everyone usually has to do when ultimately they're a dick and whatever. And so reasonably we have it to where Sharon is giving this other coworker the finger because F that guy for telling anybody any kind of story about that he got with her, which I'm sure he didn't. So pushing on, we ultimately have it to where Sharon is ultimately asking Ben, "Hey, do you want to go to this party with me?" And ultimately Ben's like, "Yeah, sure, if you want." Um, and so eventually we have it to where Sharon eventually like takes a bite out of Ben's sandwich, which I thought was weird. And then ultimately we have it to where Sharon eventually just kind of kisses Ben like in the work locker room, which I'm like, yeah, like there's a lot of times where like you would just have like coworkers who are a couple, they just kind of kiss wherever, and I'm like, dude, I don't want to see that. Like, go somewhere else. I don't want to see that garbage. Like, if anything, yeah, it's great that you like have a relationship, but I don't need to see that garbage. Go off into the sunset and frickin' kiss as much as you want, but not in this place, not in my store. Like, dude, I have to get paid to like, I have to get paid to like have like people treat me like garbage, but at some points and whichever, because ultimately I do dumb things. But kissing and seeing somebody like some co-workers just making out because ultimately it's like, oh, we have nothing better to do. It's like, you could do your job. You could do your job. God, I didn't want to say anything about stuff like that, but it's annoying. Um, but if anything, it's good for Ben, and there was nobody else in that room. But I don't know how many times you would try to talk, or you would try to do like some kind of something, like if anything, ask a girl out, and ultimately you would just be like, yeah, I'm gonna try to ask you out, but I feel uncomfortable because there's other people in this room. And so it doesn't feel work appropriate for you to do that. I'm like, nah, there never is going to be a time to be work appropriate, and plus, yeah, it sucks. So, anyways, we have it to where they go to this party, and I'm like, isn't this kind of like a work? Isn't this like a work party where like people have to like the manager is mandatorily having every one of their coworkers go to this party, so reason whatever Jenkins is planning, I'm like, isn't that a little too much to ultimately, I don't know, pushing on. So we go to this party and we have it to where ultimately out of everybody in the his house, we have Susie who is ultimately at this party because she knows a guy that knows Jenkins, and ultimately that guy is ultimately her boyfriend, which doesn't really seem like a real true cementing boyfriend, because it seems like Susie's going out of her way to be like, hey Ben, you're here. I just wanted to reminisce about the time of which that we had together, right around where me and you were at in the bathroom, and then we're gonna lock lips, and ultimately Sharon's gonna see it, and she's gonna storm out of this party. But before that happens, Ben's gonna freeze time for 2 days to try to figure out what exactly he can say to Sharon that'll make everything okay, which won't actually happen. Um, but eventually, Ben, uh, before that, we have this party supposedly kicking off, and ultimately Jenkins is of course playing a song where ultimately it's like, hey, I fell in love with a DJ or something like that, where I'm like, oh yeah, of course he plays something like that because he's the DJ. um, we have to where this party goes off, and eventually the woman of the night, let's just say, comes in, and ultimately we have to where she is, of course, doing her dance of sorts, and pretty much everybody is kind of like joking about it or just kind of having fun with it. Which ultimately, I'm like, well, that's one nice way to go about it, because there could have been another way to just be like, and there could have been this like super awkward way about going about it, which ultimately no one did. So we have it to where Michael, I think it's Michael, I could be wrong, the real actor's name is Dixon, but ultimately Barry's gonna go down a flight of stairs with a box, and I'm like, well, this is gonna go horribly awry. And but that's when ultimately Ben is ultimately locking lips with Susie, and then Sharon sees it. Ben didn't want to lock lips with Susie; he was kind of forced into it, and so ultimately he stops time to ultimately stop Sharon from leaving. But he knows full well there's nothing that he can say to stop her from being mad at him, and because ultimately he stopped time for 2 days to try to figure out like what he could say. It was kind of interesting. There was one point where um, Ben was at the soccer field and he stopped time to go and get a drink, and then he noticed there was some other guy who could easily walk through time. And so I'm like, why didn't that ever come like a point of this story to have it be like that guy like went after Sharon or something? It could have been a love triangle. Could have been an interesting story. Maybe that guy could have followed Ben, and it could have been an interesting story. Could have been like blackmailing or something. I don't know. Could have blackmailed the guy. It would have been, yeah. Who knows? It could have gone any number of routes. Um, it could have been really interesting. Like, hey, like I watched this guy stop time and look at all the crappy things that he did. Like, and Sharon would have found out about him. Like, how could you? And that could have led to the story of it not ending all copacetic and nice and whichever. But we have it to where ultimately Ben ultimately is trying to get to Sharon and ultimately trying to talk to her, and we have it to where ultimately we have Sharon who is not letting Ben come into her room, and she's just yelling at him at the door, which I'm like, dude, just have him come in and then like yell at him and then have him walk out. Like, what is he not going to leave until until you forgive him? No. But yeah, like bring him into your apartment and then yell at him. That seems kind of like it's kind of shitty. Anyways, so as I'm cussing, anyways, so going on into here, we have the slow motion of Sharon ultimately talking, and Ben ultimately like tries to come up with something to say. There's nothing to say, and ultimately he ends up leaving. So we have it to where eventually one of his stupid prankster cohorts ultimately tells Ben, "Hey, yeah, how about you? How about you show us your art?" Because ultimately, we have his coworkers that knows he goes to a class that does art, so we have it to where his coworkers ultimately called like, "Oh yeah, I've seen your stuff around your class. It's like we're really impressed with you. We want to see your entries and stuff like that." And so we have it to where Ben eventually goes to this place and ultimately asks about, "Hey, like recently, like I heard that quite possibly you guys had an appointment for me," and ultimately the guy ultimately says, "Well, no, like I didn't have an appointment." And Ben was like, "Oh, great. So somebody pulled a prank on me. Oh, that's great." And so the guy's like, "Well, I have some time. Do you have stuff for me to see?" And Ben kind of like puts a bunch of artwork out, and ultimately this artist guy is like, "Do you have more? Do you have more to ultimately show me?" And Ben's like, "Yeah, I have like hundreds." And so we have it to where this artist guy like schedules an appointment for him anyways, a legitimate appointment, because like, yeah, we're gonna set you up with a real appointment this time. So ultimately, we have Ben, who is everything's going well for him, and so they're kind of celebrating his success. And so reasonably, we have it towards the very end of this movie, where Ben just wants to kind of tie Sharon into his time stopping bubble, and because really we have it to where Ben is ultimately trying very much to just try to win Sharon over, because ultimately he has a crush on her, and so reasonably he assumes the only way to win her over is to stop time and ultimately just kind of show her like, hey, this is what I could do, and try to like pull her into this whole stopping of time and win her over. And ultimately, it seems like she does. Ultimately, it seems like they kiss, and everything just kind of works out at the end. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie. Yeah, to me, I like how just kind of innocent it is, and how like we kind of get a just kind of an interesting story. Like I don't see this movie coming up very often. So every once in a while, I'll come back to it and just be like, man, this movie's so different than anything else, and I liked the attempt of which it goes into. And um, there's a lot of risks that this movie takes, but it's like, nah, like, hey, what the heck? Like, really, when looking at it, like, reasonably, you have so many movies that are probably done around a retail environment, and um, a lot of them are just kind of severely super annoying. Like, a lot of them are just like, oh my god, like, how do we have to have like the worst kind of like retail-ish like movie? But I liked this one. This one has much more of an art kind of approach to it, where it kind of feels like um, Al Pacino ultimately from Scent of a Woman, where he's like I don't care what kind of like woman comes into this world. Like if anything, they're all beautiful. It's like basically he goes on to this rant about I think in the airplane, where he kind of just talks about like on and on and on about any kind of woman, and ultimately just kind of goes off about it, and Chris O'Donnell's like, wow, like this gift of gab. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.